In the last week of July, in the year 1492, a group of small boys were led into a room in the Vatican, somewhere past the guards, past the antechambers, past the doctors who had run out of ideas. An old man lay dying in an enormous bed, and he could no longer keep any food down. Not bread, not broth, not wine. His body had been shutting itself down for weeks, folding in on itself, refusing every kindness offered to it. And so a physician, whose name we only think we know, came up with something. He took the blood of these boys. What exactly happened after that is the whole reason people still whisper about this Pope 500 years later, and it's a story that has been retold so many times and stretched so far past whatever actually occurred, that pulling it apart is half the fun and half the tragedy. The boys did not survive. The Pope did not survive either. And the man at the center of it all, Giovanni Battista Cybo, who the world remembers as Pope Innocent VIII, went to his grave with a bronze tomb, a fortune handed to his children, and a reputation that no amount of gilding could quite cover up. That's where his story ends, more or less, and it's a bleak place to start. But that ending has swallowed everything that came before it. And there was a lot that came before it. A whole life. 60 years of a man climbing, spending, scheming, fathering children he shouldn't have, and acknowledging them anyway, taking money from a Turkish sultan, putting his seal on a document that would help kill tens of thousands of people he'd never meet. The blood story is the thing people remember, and we'll get there. We'll take our time with it, because it deserves care. But the strange truth of Innocent VIII is that the deathbed horror is almost the least interesting thing about him, and by the time we get back to that room, I think you'll see what I mean. Before we get into all of it though, welcome in. If you're new here, thank you for showing up, and if you've been around a while, you already know how this goes. So settle in, grab something to drink, get comfortable, do whatever it is you do when you put one of these on, and do me a small favor while you're at it. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from, because I genuinely love reading them, and it's always wilder than I expect. To everyone supporting the channel, whether that's a like, a share, or just sticking around all the way, it means more than I can really put into words, and it's the thing that keeps these long ones possible, so thank you. All right, that's enough of that. Back to Rome, and back to a man whose whole life was, in a strange way, a long, slow warm-up for the odd little horror show he became famous for. He was born in Genoa in 1432 on the 5th of November, and the family name was Cybo, sometimes spelled Cybo, and they were not nobodies. Genoa in the 15th century was a maritime republic, a city of merchants and bankers and sailors, hard-edged and money-minded, forever squabbling with Venice over trade and forever tearing itself apart in factional feuds at home. It was a good place to be born rich and a dangerous place to be born poor, and the Cybo family fell comfortably on the right side of that line. His father, Arano, sometimes called Aaron, had been a viceroy of Naples and would end up as a senator in Rome. Old Genoese stock, some Greek somewhere back in the bloodline, the sort of family that produced sons who ended up in comfortable positions without having to fight too hard for them. His mother was Teodorina de Mari from another established Genoese house. So the boy grew up with connections in two directions at once, in his home city and down in Naples, and both of those threads would matter later. Because young Giovanni Battista spent a good chunk of his youth in the orbit of the Neapolitan court, and Naples was, by every account we have, not a place designed to keep a young man out of trouble. The court of the Aragonese kings was lively, worldly, full of ambition and pleasure, and the sort of casual moral flexibility that tends to come with money and power sitting close together, and into that drop a good-looking, well-connected young man with no particular vocation for anything except enjoying himself, and you can guess how it went. You have to understand the shape of a career like his to see how ordinary it actually was for its time, and how little his loose youth was ever going to hold him back. A young man from a good family, in that era, didn't necessarily choose the church out of any burning faith. The church was a career, one of the very few respectable and lucrative careers available to a well-born younger son who wasn't going to inherit the family fortune outright. It came with income, with security, with a ladder to climb, with the possibility of enormous wealth and power at the top of it. Whether you actually believed much of anything was, frankly, close to beside the point. What mattered was your connections, your patrons, your usefulness to powerful men, and your willingness to play the long, patient game of favors and appointments. Giovanni Battista Cybo had the connections in both Genoa and Naples. He had a father who'd been a viceroy and would sit in the Roman Senate, and he had the easy, agreeable manner that made powerful men comfortable around him. That last quality would carry him a very long way, further than any amount of piety ever could have. People liked him. That's a real and underrated form of power, and he had it in abundance. His youth was, and I'll use the polite word that the old Catholic writers used, licentious. He was not headed for holiness. Nobody looking at him at 20 would have picked him out as a future pope. He was a good-looking young man in a rich, loose city, and he did what young men in rich, loose cities tend to do, and the results of that would follow him for the rest of his life in a very literal, walking around, calling him father kind of way. Because he had children. At least 2 that he openly acknowledged, a son named Franceschetto and a daughter named Teodorina, named after his mother, and probably several more. And this was all before he took holy orders. I want to sit on the acknowledgement part for a moment, because it's genuinely unusual, and it tells you something about the man. Most churchmen with illegitimate children spent enormous energy pretending those children weren't theirs. They called them nephews, wards, vaguely related young people who just happened to keep turning up at the papal court with excellent connections and a suspicious family resemblance. The whole institution ran on a polite fiction that men who had taken vows of celibacy were, of course, celibate, and everyone agreed to look at the nephews and nod along. Cybo didn't really bother with that fiction. He acknowledged his kids, openly, called them his son and his daughter, in the plain meaning of the words. For a man who would one day be pope, that was either a strange sort of honesty or a strange sort of shamelessness, and Rome could never quite decide which. And honestly, I'm not sure it's fully decidable even now. There's something almost disarming about it. He wasn't hiding. He just was what he was. And he saw no reason to lie about the 2 people he loved most in the world, even when the whole weight of the church's dignity said he should. The rumor mill, of course, went much further than the 2 acknowledged children. The gossip in Rome held that he had fathered 16 children in total, 8 boys and 8 girls, all of them by married women, a specific and suspiciously symmetrical number that should make you raise an eyebrow right away, because real life is rarely that tidy. A poet even wrote a little Latin epigram about it that made the rounds of the city, and it's genuinely clever in a vicious way. The joke turned on his papal name, Innocent, in Latin, innocens, carrying the sense of harmless, blameless, guiltless. And the poem said, roughly, that the noxious one, the harmful one, had produced 8 boys and just as many girls, so Rome could fairly call him father. The pun is nasty in Latin, and it does not survive translation cleanly, but you get the shape of it. The man who took the name Innocent, they said, was anything but, and the city of Rome was, in a sense, full of his children, so calling him the father of Rome landed as both a formal compliment to a pope and a filthy insult at the same time, folded into one line. Renaissance Romans found that sort of thing hilarious. 2 acknowledged kids is what we can actually stand on with confidence. 7 or so is plausible, going by the more sober sources. 16 is the sort of number that gets funnier the more people repeat it, and it stuck to him for centuries precisely because it was so quotable. You'll still see it cited today as fact, this Pope with 16 bastards, and it may be an exaggeration built on a real foundation of a man who genuinely did have more children than a Pope was supposed to have, which was any children at all. His path into the church, once he finally took it, was smooth in the way that paths tend to be smooth for the well-connected. And it's almost comical how little the earlier licentiousness slowed him down. He became a canon at the cathedral in Capua, a nice, comfortable ecclesiastical post. After the Neapolitan king he'd attached himself to died, King Alfonso, things got awkward with the Archbishop of Genoa, and he drifted off to Padua, the great university town, and then to Rome, where he found a patron in Cardinal Filippo Calandrini, who happened to be the half-brother of a former pope, Nicholas V. Good patron to have, and he became a priest around 1450 in the ordinary way. From there the ladder went up quickly, one rung after another, each one lifting him further from that loose young man in Naples and closer to the throne of St. Peter. Bishop of Savona in 1467, consecrated in January of that year. Then transferred to the See of Molfetta in 1472. And then, in May of 1473, Pope Sixtus IV made him a cardinal. He held the title of Santa Balbina first, then Santa Cecilia, the old churches of Rome that gave cardinals their formal names, and he served as Camerlengo, the chamberlain of the College of Cardinals, not a ceremonial post at all, but a genuinely powerful one, because the Camerlengo runs the machinery of the church during the interregnum, the empty stretch after a pope dies and before a new one is chosen. It's the office that manages the treasury, secures the property, and organizes the conclave. Putting yourself in that chair means you're standing at the exact spot where power changes hands, and that is a very useful place to stand. Nothing about this climb was remarkable for a man of his connections, and that's part of what makes him such a revealing figure. He wasn't a brilliant theologian who rose on the strength of his mind. He wasn't a saintly ascetic whose holiness pulled him upward against his will. He was a well-born, agreeable, capable enough administrator who knew the right people and made himself useful and never frightened anyone. And in the church of the late 15th century, that combination was more than enough to carry a man from a comfortable canonry all the way to a cardinal's red hat. The system rewarded exactly the qualities he had: the smoothness, the pliability, the talent for being liked, and it would keep rewarding them right up until they carried him past his own competence and onto a throne he was never remotely equipped to fill. His whole rise reads, in hindsight, as a study in how an institution can promote a man to the precise level where his weaknesses do the most damage. His rise owed a great deal to one particular man, a cardinal named Giuliano della Rovere. And I want you to hold on to that name, because della Rovere is going to keep showing up, right to the very end, right to the deathbed itself, and he is one of the most consequential figures of this whole era. Della Rovere was ambitious, sharp, physically imposing, hard as a nail, the sort of man who filled a room and made other men uneasy. He would eventually become Pope Julius II, the warrior pope, the one who put on armor and led armies personally, who commissioned Michelangelo's Sistine ceiling and terrified everyone in his path. But in the 1480s, della Rovere was a kingmaker rather than a king, a nephew of the reigning Pope Sixtus, wielding enormous influence from behind the throne, and Giovanni Battista Cybo was, more or less, his man. Cybo admired him, ardently, the sources say, leaned on him, followed his lead. And when the moment came to actually pick a new pope, that relationship would be the entire game. Once Cybo became pope, della Rovere didn't fade into the background the way a mere sponsor might. He became, by many accounts, the real force behind a good deal of Innocent's policy, the strong will steering the weak one. When Innocent got dragged into the war with Naples, into backing the rebellious barons, della Rovere's influence was there in the background pushing events along, because della Rovere had his own long feud with Naples and his own reasons for wanting that fight. It's genuinely difficult, looking back, to draw a clean line between where Innocent's own judgment ended and where della Rovere's began, and that ambiguity is itself the point. Contemporaries said outright that Innocent was a tool of della Rovere, that the cardinal governed and the pope signed. It's an unkind assessment and probably an exaggerated one, but there's real substance under it, because Innocent genuinely didn't have the iron in him to resist a man like that, and della Rovere genuinely did have the iron to impose himself. The two of them would eventually cool toward each other, and della Rovere would clash bitterly with the Pope who came after, the Borgia, before finally seizing the throne himself years later. But for much of Innocent's reign, if you wanted to understand who was actually driving, you looked past the Pope to the Cardinal standing just behind him. Sixtus IV died in August of 1484, and Rome did what Rome always did when a pope died, which was fall apart at the seams almost the instant the news got out. This is worth understanding because it happened again when Innocent himself died, so it's a pattern you'll see twice. The moment a pope's heart stopped, all order went with it because in a very real sense the pope was the state, and with the state suddenly headless, the city reverted to something close to raw violence. Mobs broke into the papal granaries and hauled off the grain. They went after the banks run by the Genoese merchants. The great aristocratic families, the Orsini and the Colonna and the rest, armed their households and barricaded their palaces and prepared to settle old scores. The Colonna clans seized back fortresses they claimed had been stolen from them. For a few days, the city belonged to whoever had the most men with weapons on a given street, and the ordinary people of Rome shuttered their homes and prayed for it to be over. Into that chaos, the cardinals shuffled off to lock themselves away and choose a successor, trying to conduct the solemn business of electing God's representative on earth while the city burned and looted itself down below. The favorite to beat going into that conclave was a Venetian, Cardinal Marco Barbo, a serious and rather austere man, the sort who actually took the faith seriously and might have tried to reform things, to clean up the corruption and the nepotism and the venality that had been building for decades. And that possibility, a genuine reformer on the throne, made a great many powerful and comfortable people extremely nervous. Reform meant their arrangements might end. So the night before the vote, two cardinals went to work in the shadows. Giuliano della Rovere and Rodrigo Borgia, the Spaniard who would himself one day become the infamous Alexander VI, the most notorious pope of them all, moved quietly from cell to cell inside the sealed conclave, buying votes. Promises of benefices, of lucrative offices, of hard money, of positions and pensions for relatives, whatever it took to peel a cardinal away from Barbo. This is simony, the buying and selling of sacred offices, named after Simon Magus in the Book of Acts, who tried to purchase the power of the Holy Spirit and got cursed for it. It was flatly, explicitly against every rule the Church had. And it was also, by this point in the 15th century, simply how these elections worked, an open secret, a routine. It helps to sit for a second with what a papal conclave in this era was really like, stripped of the incense and the solemnity we tend to picture. Dozens of aging, ambitious, worldly men, most of them princes of great families in their own right, sealed together in a cramped and increasingly foul set of rooms, cut off from the outside world, sleeping in curtained-off cells lined up in a row, eating food passed in through a turning hatch. The theory was that isolation and the fear of God would concentrate their minds on choosing the holiest candidate under the guidance of the Holy Spirit. The practice was a pressure cooker of deal-making, threats, promises, and horse trading, where the real negotiations happened in whispers in the dark between the cells. And a man like Della Rovere, who understood exactly how to apply pressure and where, could move through that sealed world like a fixer working a room. Cybo, in all of this, was not a driving force. He was the compromise, the safe pair of hands, the man everyone could live with precisely because he threatened no one and would owe everyone. His ascension, as one modern reference dryly puts it, was not the result of his personal strengths. It was the result of his personal weaknesses, which were exactly the qualities the men doing the actual choosing were looking for in a pope they could manage. Everyone involved signed a document beforehand, an election capitulation, a formal agreement meant to bind whoever won to a long list of promises about how he'd govern and what he'd share out. Those documents were never, ever worth the parchment they were written on. Because the first thing a new pope discovered was that he was now infallible in matters of faith and answerable to no earthly power. And the promises he'd made as a mere cardinal evaporated the moment the white smoke went up. When the votes were finally counted, the man who came out on top was Cybo. Not because of any towering personal quality, not because anyone thought he was holy or wise or strong. He was pleasant, agreeable, weak, and above all, controllable. Della Rovere wanted a pope he could steer, and Cybo was a man who could be steered. On the 29th of August, 1484, Giovanni Battista Cybo became Pope Innocent VIII, taking the name in honor of a fellow Genoese, Innocent IV, who had held the office 2 centuries earlier. The New Catholic Encyclopedia, which is not exactly a hostile anti-Catholic source, describes the whole election as shameless bribery. That's the Church's own reference book, in plain print, describing how one of its own popes came to the throne. Now, the thing you notice immediately about Innocent's papacy, the problem that would define the entire 8 years of it, is that he inherited an empty treasury and a very full set of appetites, both his own and his family's, and squaring those 2 facts became the defining struggle of his reign. Sixtus, his predecessor, had spent staggering sums on his own relatives and on wars and on building projects, and the papal coffers were scraped dry. There was no money. And yet here was a new pope with children to provide for, a court to maintain, allies to pay off, and the general standard of Renaissance papal magnificence to uphold. So Innocent did what a man does when he desperately needs money and happens to hold an office that can, at least in theory, manufacture value out of thin air. He started selling things. And not just the ordinary things that were already for sale. He got creative. He created brand new offices, positions that had simply never existed before in the history of the Church, invented purely so that he could turn around and sell them to the highest bidder. The numbers here are real, and they're documented, and they are genuinely a little breathtaking when you lay them out. He expanded the pool of papal secretaries to 26, and the new posts were sold off, bringing in something on the order of 62,000 ducats. He created and appointed 52 men called plumbatores, the officials whose job was to attach the lead seals to papal documents, the little disc of lead that made a bull official. And each of those 52 men paid 2,500 ducats for the privilege of holding that office. Think about what that transaction actually is. He's not raising money by taxing land or trade or by any productive activity. He's raising it by conjuring up a job title, attaching a fee to it, and finding a wealthy man willing to pay. And once you've paid a small fortune to buy yourself a job, you don't then sit in it out of the pure goodness of your heart and serve the Church for free. You make that money back, and then a healthy profit on top, by charging for every single thing you touch in the course of your duties. So the venality didn't stay at the top. It flowed downward and outward through the whole system. Every office extracting its fee, every document costing something, every stamp and seal and signature having a price. Everything in Rome, as one observer put it, seemed to be for sale. From a judge's pardon in a criminal case all the way up to, well, the papacy itself, as he'd just demonstrated by buying it. And here's where the story curdles from ordinary corruption, which the Renaissance was frankly swimming in, into something with a darker edge. Two of these papal secretaries, men who'd bought their way into the office of writing and issuing papal documents, were caught forging them, and not petty stuff, not a fudged date here or there. They confessed, under questioning, to having forged more than 50 papal bulls over the space of 2 years. 50 official documents, complete with seals, purporting to carry the authority of the Pope himself, sold to whoever would pay for a decree they wanted. One of the forged documents, and I love this detail because it's so oddly specific and it opens a little window onto how the trade worked, was a bull granting Norwegian priests permission to celebrate Mass without wine, presumably because wine was genuinely hard to come by that far north, and so there was real demand for an official-looking exemption, and where there's demand, there's a forger willing to supply. The 2 men were caught, and they were hanged, and then their bodies were burned afterward for good measure, which tells you that the punishment for corruption in Innocent's Rome depended almost entirely on whether you were freelancing on your own account or whether you were paying your cut into the system properly. Sell offices from the throne, that's governance. Forge the documents yourself and skip the middleman, that's a hanging. There's a dark comedy in the whole affair once you look at it squarely. The Pope was, in effect, running an enormous, legal, official forgery operation of his own, manufacturing offices out of nothing and selling the paper, and the men he'd sold those offices to simply took the logic one step further and started manufacturing the documents themselves, cutting out the Pope's fee. From their point of view, they were only doing what the whole system taught them to do, treating the sacred machinery of the church as a printing press for money. The difference between what they did and what Innocent did was really just a matter of authorization, of who got to sign off and take the cut, and they died for getting that distinction wrong. The Church's own instrument of authority, the papal bull, the document that could bind consciences and grant dispensations and reshape men's spiritual lives, had become a commodity so thoroughly that people were counterfeiting it like coins, and the counterfeiters and the mint were doing more or less the same thing with a different letterhead. There's a line that comes down to us, supposedly overheard by a chronicler named Infessura, and we are going to talk a great deal about Infessura before we're done, where a papal official explains away the near total absence of real justice in the city with a grim little joke. God does not desire the death of a sinner, the man said, twisting an old scriptural line, but rather that he should live and pay. That was the machine Innocent was running, distilled into a single black joke. Sin, in his Rome, was not a thing to be punished and stamped out. Sin was a revenue stream. A man who sinned and could be made to pay for absolution was worth more alive and guilty than dead and forgiven. The whole apparatus of penance and pardon had been quietly bent into a collection system, and you should understand what that actually meant for the ordinary business of living and dying in Rome under this Pope, because it wasn't an abstraction. Rome in these years was a violent, lawless place, and Innocent's administration did remarkably little to change that, in part because a peaceful city generates fewer fines than a turbulent one. Murders were common, so common that the chroniclers noted them almost as weather. The great families ran the streets of their own districts as private fiefdoms, settling scores with hired knives, and the papal justice that should have restrained them was for sale like everything else, so that a rich man could kill and pay his way clear while a poor one hanged. Bandits worked the roads right up to the gates of the city, so that travel outside the walls, even a short distance from the safety of home, meant real risk of robbery or worse. And pilgrims coming to Rome for their soul's sake were fair game for the men waiting along the way. This was the city Innocent governed, or failed to govern, for 8 years. A place where the law was a price list, and violence was a constant low hum under everything else, and where the Pope's own son was pulling a cut from the fines and carrying it to the card table. Call it orderly disorder, a system that had learned to profit from its own rot. Moving from how he raised his money to how he spent it takes us straight to his family, and specifically to his son, because Franceschetto was where an enormous amount of that money went. Franceschetto Cybo. This is the boy from Naples, now a grown man in his late 30s, and he is, I have to be honest, one of the more thoroughly unimpressive figures to attach himself to a papal court. And given the competition in that particular arena, that's really saying something. He was, by every account we have, a gambler and a wastrel with no visible talents beyond the single accident of being the Pope's son, and it turned out, in that time and place, that this one qualification was entirely enough. The nickname itself, Franceschetto, is a diminutive, little Francesco, and he seems to have been small in stature, which the Romans, being Romans, noted and enjoyed. Innocent showered him with everything the office could provide. Franceschetto was made governor and captain general of Rome, given military and civil authority over the city. He was granted the fiefs of Cerveteri and Anguillara, castles and lands north of Rome that had been taken from the Orsini family, which of course made the Orsini furious and stored up trouble for later. He was made a count, given the grand title of Count of the Lateran Palace, and in a detail that really captures the flavor of the whole arrangement, he collected a personal cut of the fines levied in the ecclesiastical courts of the city. So when Rome caught and fined its wrongdoers, the money didn't all go to the church or the poor. A slice of it went straight into the pocket of the Pope's gambling son, who then carried it off to the gaming table and lost it. Think about what that arrangement did to the incentives running through the whole city. The Pope's own son had a direct personal financial stake in there being plenty of sin to fine. Every gambler caught, every blasphemer, every man hauled before the ecclesiastical courts meant coin in Franceschetto's purse. It's the venality of the whole papacy in miniature, distilled down into one grasping man. The idea that wrongdoing was not a problem to be solved, but a resource to be harvested, and the harvest went to the family. And Franceschetto was, by all accounts, not remotely up to the dignity of any of the offices heaped on him. Captain General of Rome is a serious military title, and it was held by a man whose only demonstrated talent was losing at cards. The Romans, who missed nothing and forgave less, took his measure quickly and held him in open contempt. This small, luckless, entitled son of a pope, given the keys to the city because of an accident of birth to a father who'd had him before he ever took holy orders. And the gaming table did not treat him kindly. In one single night, Franceschetto is said to have lost 14,000 ducats to a cardinal, Raffaele Riario, a nephew of the previous pope, and then, wounded and sulking like a child, he went to his father to complain that he'd been cheated, that the game had been rigged against him. Some versions of the story put the loss much higher, at 60,000 ducats, an almost unimaginable sum, money that supposedly helped that same cardinal build one of the grand palaces of Rome, the Cancelleria, which still stands today. A beautiful Renaissance building that may quite literally have been financed by the Pope's son's terrible luck at cards. I'd take the exact figures with a healthy grain of salt, because these numbers have a way of swelling in the retelling, and 14,000 and 60,000 are very different amounts. But the gambling itself is well attested from multiple directions, and the image of the Pope's son whining to his father that a card game was rigged, apparently without a flicker of awareness that the entire system feeding him was rigged from top to bottom, that a man in his position complaining about unfairness was itself the joke, is the sort of detail that stays with you. Franceschetto had one genuinely ugly moment that's worth telling in full, because it lays bare the loyalty running through that family. In September of 1490, a rumour swept through Rome that the Pope had died. He hadn't. He was ill, as he increasingly was in those years, and the rumour got out ahead of the fact, the way rumours do. And Franceschetto's very first instinct upon believing that his father was dead, his father, the man who had given him everything, was to try to rush the papal treasury and seize as much of it as he could carry before anyone could stop him. Not to grieve, not to pray, to loot. His own father supposedly lying dead in the next room, and the son's immediate plan was to strip the place bare. When Innocent turned out to be very much alive, the whole grasping business had to be quietly hushed up and walked back, and everyone pretended it hadn't happened. It gives you an unsentimental picture of the affection running through that household, and Franceschetto's habits would prove consistent right to the end. To secure Franceschetto's future in a way that gambling and looting couldn't, though, Innocent needed a proper marriage, a dynastic one, and here he pulled off the single, genuinely shrewd piece of statecraft of his whole reign. He married his gambling, treasury-raiding, card-cheated son into the most important family in all of Italy, the Medici of Florence. In January of 1488, Franceschetto Cybo married Maddalena de' Medici, the daughter of Lorenzo the Magnificent himself, the uncrowned Prince of Florence, the greatest patron of the Renaissance, the man at the very center of the Italian world. Maddalena was around 15 years old. She brought a dowry of 4,000 ducats. And Lorenzo, in return for placing his daughter inside the papal family and gaining a direct line into the Vatican, got something he wanted a great deal more than he wanted to give away 4,000 ducats and a daughter. He got a cardinal's hat for his son. His own second son, Giovanni de' Medici, was made a cardinal by Innocent as part of the bargain. And Giovanni was, at the time of his nomination, 13 years old. 13. A boy who by rights should have been at his lessons was elevated into the highest governing rank of the Christian Church, a prince of the Church, all because his sister had married the Pope's son, and his father was the most powerful man in Florence. And this was simply how the trade worked at that level. There was a fig leaf of decency draped over it, a stipulation that he wouldn't openly take up the role for a few years until he was slightly less absurdly young, but the deal was the deal. And that boy, that 13-year-old cardinal, would grow up to become Pope Leo X, the Pope who happened to be sitting on the throne of St. Peter when an obscure German monk named Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to a church door and cracked all of Western Christianity clean in half. The whole Protestant Reformation, the wars of religion, centuries of division, all of it unfolded under and partly because of that man, whose journey to the papacy began with this transaction. A deal between two fathers, trading their children back and forth for advantage, each convinced he'd gotten the better end of it, and each, in his own terms, entirely right. Spare a thought, though, for the two young people who were actually the currency in that exchange. Maddalena de' Medici, 15 years old, sent from Florence to live inside the papal family and share a bed and a life with Franceschetto Cybo, a gambling man well into his 30s with a reputation already fixed. She hadn't chosen him. She'd been handed over as one half of a transaction her father wanted for reasons of state, and she would spend her marriage tied to a man whose chief occupations were losing money and grasping after more of it. And her little brother Giovanni, 13, robed as a cardinal, a boy dressed up in the scarlet of a prince of the church before he'd finished growing, set on a path he'd had no say in either. Both of them children, moved across the board by grown men, and both of their lives permanently shaped by a bargain struck over their heads in the winter of 1488. The Renaissance ran on marriages like that, and the people inside them rarely got a vote. The alliance did buy a few years of relative peace in Italy, and that's worth crediting, because Lorenzo the Magnificent was a genuinely gifted political operator who understood that stability served Florence better than chaos, that a balance of power kept the wolves at bay. With his son-in-law's family running the papacy, Lorenzo could quietly steer papal policy toward keeping the peninsula calm. For a man like Innocent, who had no real appetite for grand schemes or bold strokes, who mostly wanted his debts paid and his family provided for and a quiet life, having the shrewdest man in Italy whispering sensible advice into his ear was probably the best thing that happened during his entire pontificate. When Lorenzo died in 1492, just months before Innocent himself, that steadying hand was gone, and the peace didn't long survive either of them. His daughter, meanwhile, the other acknowledged child, Teodorina, was married off and did well enough out of her father's rise, as daughters of powerful men tended to, becoming part of the web of family alliances that Innocent spun out from the papal throne. Because that's really what the whole business was, underneath the individual deals. Innocent was using the papacy, an office that was supposed to belong to no family and to serve all of Christendom, as a machine for the advancement of the Cybo name. The offices, the fiefs, the marriages, the cardinals' hats traded back and forth, all of it flowed toward the same end, which was planting his blood in the ruling families of Italy and setting his children up for good. It was nepotism, from the Latin for nephew, which is fitting given how many popes disguised their children as nephews, and Innocent practiced it about as openly as anyone. He didn't invent the game. Sixtus before him had played it hard, stuffing the College of Cardinals with relatives and carving out principalities for his nephews. But Innocent played it with a certain shamelessness, because in his case the beneficiaries really were his own children, and everyone knew it, and he made little effort to pretend otherwise. But peace was never going to be the thing Innocent's name got carved onto, because on the 5th of December, 1484, only a few months into his reign, before he'd even really settled into the job, he put his papal seal on a document whose consequences would spill across the whole of Europe for the better part of 2.5 centuries and cost tens of thousands of lives, most of them women's lives, most of them poor, most of them innocent in the plain sense of the word. The document is known by its opening Latin words, summis desiderantes affectibus, which means something like desiring with the deepest longing, and it is, in blunt terms, the witch bull. The papal bull that lent the full, formal authority of the Church of Rome to the hunting and killing of witches. Here's how it came about, and I want to walk through the origins because they're grubbier and more bureaucratic than the grand cosmic evil framing the document later acquired. There was a Dominican friar and inquisitor named Heinrich Kramer, sometimes Latinized as Institoris, and he was, by any reasonable measure, a fanatic, and quite possibly genuinely unwell, obsessed with witchcraft and with the sexual wickedness of women in a way that unsettled even his own contemporaries, who were not exactly a progressive bunch themselves. Kramer had been trying to run witch trials up in the German lands, and he kept hitting a wall, because the local clergy and the local bishops kept blocking him. They disputed his authority. They told him, in effect, that he had no standing to come marching into their dioceses and start arresting and torturing and burning their parishioners on his own say-so, and they turned him away, which, viewed from a certain angle, means the local German church was actually acting as a brake on the madness, containing this man, refusing to let him run wild. So Kramer did what obsessive men do when the people around them won't cooperate. He went over their heads. He went all the way to the top, to the Pope, to Rome, and he asked for a document that would blow past all the local resistance and hand him the authority he craved. And Innocent, who seems to have understood very little about the theological or human machinery he was setting in motion, and who cared even less, distracted as he was by money troubles and his son and Naples, gave Kramer more or less exactly what he asked for. The bull declared, with the full weight of papal authority behind it, that witchcraft was real, not a delusion, not a peasant superstition, not a matter for skepticism, but a genuine, present, terrible reality. It stated that people, and it singled out women in particular, were consorting with demons, giving themselves over to devils in body and soul, and that through this they were blighting crops in the field, killing infants in the womb and at the breast, striking men with impotence, ruining livestock, poisoning the harvest, calling down storms, all of it, the whole catalogue of rural disaster suddenly reframed as the deliberate work of women in league with hell. And it authorized Kramer and his colleague Jacob Sprenger to prosecute these people across a broad swath of Germany, naming the provinces, and it explicitly forbade anyone, any local cleric or official, from getting in their way. It ordered the Bishop of Strasbourg to lend them his active support. So in a single stroke of the pen, the Pope had taken a marginal fanatic whom the German clergy had been more or less successfully containing and handed him a golden license, straight from Rome, to do whatever he wanted. Now, the careful historians who study this period will point out, quite rightly, that the bull itself didn't actually invent anything new in law. Popes before Innocent had made similar noises about the reality of witchcraft going back more than a century. In strict legal terms, the document broke no fresh ground, and there's a serious scholarly argument that Innocent's real motives were about jurisdiction and church authority, and probably revenue, rather than any personal burning zeal to cleanse the world of witches. He likely gave it about as much thought as he gave to any other petition that crossed his desk with the right fees attached. But motives are one thing, and consequences are another thing entirely, and the consequence of this particular routine document was catastrophic. And the reason it was catastrophic comes down to what Kramer did with it next. The thing the bull really did, in the practical sense, was solve Kramer's authority problem. Before it, he was a lone inquisitor whom local bishops could and did turn away, telling him he had no jurisdiction in their territory. After it, he could produce a document from Rome, from the Pope himself, specifically naming him and specifically ordering local authorities not to obstruct him, and specifically instructing a bishop to back him with force. It converted him from a crank the local church could contain into an agent of Rome that the local church was commanded to assist. And a document like that, once issued, doesn't stay pointed only at the situation that produced it. It becomes a precedent, a tool, a piece of leverage that can be waved in front of any hesitant official anywhere. Innocent almost certainly thought he was resolving a minor jurisdictional squabble in a distant province, doing a favor for a persistent friar, clearing a bit of paperwork off his desk. What he'd actually handed over was a key that unlocked doors he never saw and never thought about again. Kramer took that bull, that papal endorsement, and a couple of years later, around 1486, he wrote a book, a manual, a comprehensive, systematic, step-by-step guide to identifying and prosecuting and torturing and executing witches, a technical handbook for the destruction of human beings, and he called it the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches. And he printed the Pope's bull right there at the front of it, in the opening pages, so that anyone who opened the book saw, first thing, before a single word of Kramer's own poison, what appeared to be the personal, explicit endorsement of the papacy for everything that followed. The reader would see the Pope's words, the Pope's authority, and then turn the page into a detailed instruction manual for finding a woman, accusing her, stripping and searching her for the devil's marks, torturing her until she confessed to crimes that were physically impossible, extracting the names of other women, and then killing her. The bull at the front was the seal of legitimacy on all of it, and the book spread. It spread precisely because it arrived at the same moment as the printing press, which meant it could be reproduced and carried across Europe in a way no manuscript ever could. It became one of the most reprinted works of the entire era, running through edition after edition, turning up in the hands of magistrates and inquisitors and frightened town councils across the continent. And over the following 2.5 centuries or so, across Europe, something in the range of 40,000 to 60,000 people were executed as witches. The exact number is genuinely hard to pin down, and scholars argue about it, but that's roughly the responsible estimate, 40,000 to 60,000, and the overwhelming majority, 3 out of 4 or more, were women. dragged from their homes on the word of a neighbor or a rival or a frightened child, tortured on the rack or with thumb screws or by sleep deprivation until they would confess to anything at all, to flying through the night, to kissing the devil, to whatever the manual said witches did, and then burned or hanged, or in some places drowned. Now, honesty demands that we not lay all 40 to 60,000 of those deaths at Innocent's feet. And I want to be clear about that, because it would be too easy and it wouldn't be true. The machinery of the great witch hunts had many engineers, and the very worst of the killing came generations after Innocent was safely in his grave, driven by the religious wars that tore Europe apart after the Reformation, by local famines and plagues and panics, by the collapse of trust in communities under unbearable stress. No single document caused all of that. The church itself would actually go on to censure the Malleus within a few years of its publication, and there's evidence that Sprenger, the co-author whose name Kramer used, may have actually turned against Kramer and tried to keep him out of the Dominican houses in his territory. So the picture is tangled. But Innocent's seal was on the front of the book, his words, his authority, dressing up the worst of it as though Rome had blessed it. And that appearance did real work in the world. A nervous magistrate in some small German or Swiss town, holding a printed book that opened with the Pope's own solemn declaration that witches were real and must be hunted, was a great deal more willing to sign the order and light the fire than he might otherwise have been. Innocent didn't strike the match himself. He just made the match a great deal easier to strike, over and over, in thousands of towns, for a very long time after he was gone. He signed a petition to make an inquisitor's paperwork go through, and the paperwork went out and helped build the bonfires. It's the ordinariness of the accusation, once the machine got going, that makes it so grim to read about. The women who died were mostly not mysterious or powerful figures. They were poor, old, often, widowed, living alone, dependent on the goodwill of neighbors who could turn on them the moment a cow died, or a child sickened, or a harvest failed, and someone needed a reason. A midwife whose delivery went wrong, a woman who had quarreled with the wrong family, a beggar who had cursed someone who refused her at the door, and then that someone's luck turned. The book Kramer wrote gave the accusers a framework that made all of it fit, that turned ordinary rural misfortune into evidence of a vast demonic conspiracy staffed almost entirely by women, and it gave the torturers permission to keep going until the confession came, and under enough pain the confession always came. That's the world the seal at the front of that book helped legitimize, and it ran for 2 centuries, and it was one of the longer and darker legacies any pope ever left behind, all from a document Innocent probably signed without a second thought. Away from the horror slowly unfolding in the German and Alpine towns, Innocent had a stranger and far more personal arrangement running right there in Rome itself, one that turned him, the supreme head of the Christian church, into the paid jailer of a Muslim prince. This is the affair of Cem, sometimes written Gem, sometimes Zizim in the old sources, and it is one of the most genuinely bizarre episodes of the entire Renaissance papacy, strange enough that you'd assume it was invented if the documentation weren't so solid. Cem was an Ottoman prince, a son of Mehmed II, Mehmed the Conqueror, the sultan who had taken Constantinople in 1453 and ended the Roman Empire for good. When Mehmed died in 1481, his two sons fought over the throne, as Ottoman princes tended to do, because the empire had no fixed rule of succession, and the custom was more or less that the throne went to whichever brother could seize it and kill the others first. Cem's older brother Bayezid won that fight, and Cem, having lost, and knowing exactly what usually happened to the losing brother in these contests, which was strangulation with a silk bowstring so as not to spill royal blood, did the only sensible thing. He ran. And his flight took him somewhere no one could have predicted. He ended up, of all people, in the hands of the Knights of Rhodes, the crusading military order of the Knights Hospitaller, the sworn enemies of his own empire. They took him in, and then he was moved on to France, held by the order there for years, and eventually, in March of 1489, after a good deal of maneuvering between various Christian powers, all of whom recognized his value, he was handed over to Pope Innocent and brought to the Vatican under heavy guard, escorted right into the heart of Christendom. And Innocent suddenly found himself holding what amounted to a golden ticket, because as long as Cem was alive and in Christian hands, he was a living threat to his brother Bayezid, the sitting sultan. A rival claimant to the Ottoman throne, breathing, healthy, sitting in Rome, who could in theory be released at any moment, armed, funded and pointed straight back at the Ottoman Empire to reignite the civil war whenever the Christian powers felt like causing trouble. Bayezid understood the danger with perfect clarity, and so Bayezid paid. He paid the Pope enormous sums, essentially a ransom in reverse, to keep his own brother securely locked up and out of circulation, to make sure Cem stayed a comfortable prisoner and never became a free rival. And the figures that come down to us are staggering. There was a lump sum reported at 120,000 crowns, which contemporaries said was equal to all the rest of the papacy's annual income put together. On top of that, an annual payment somewhere in the range of 40 to 45,000 ducats, essentially a yearly retainer, a salary paid by the Muslim sultan to the Christian pope for the service of imprisoning a Muslim prince. And beyond all the money, Bayezid sent gifts to sweeten the arrangement, and one of those gifts was a relic, the Holy Lance, the spear that was said to have pierced the side of Christ as he hung on the cross. The spear of Longinus, one of the most sacred physical objects in all of Christianity, sent to the Pope by the Sultan of the Ottomans as part of a deal to jail his brother, and delivered to Rome in that final year, 1492. I want you to sit with the whole shape of that for a moment, because it really is one of the strangest tableaus of the age. The head of the Catholic Church, the keeper of the keys of St. Peter, the man who claimed spiritual authority over all of Western Christendom, was drawing what amounted to a regular salary from the Ottoman Sultan to serve as a glorified prison warden for a Muslim prince, and part of his payment for this service was a piece of the actual Passion of Christ handed over by an unbeliever. Whenever Bayezid rattled his sabers near the Christian territories in the Balkans, threatening a fresh invasion, the Pope could gently and pointedly remind him that Cem was right here in Rome, well-fed and healthy and very much available for release. It was, in its cold way, an elegant piece of statecraft, and it did the one thing Innocent needed above all others, which was to pour foreign gold into the Vatican's chronically empty pockets. There was almost nothing recognizably Christian about any of it, and Cem himself spent his years as a comfortable, gilded, meaningless hostage, a bargaining chip in a game played over his head between men who would never let him go free and never quite let him die on their watch either, because a live Cem was worth a fortune and a dead one was worth nothing. He was treated well, in the material sense. He was housed handsomely, given a household, paraded on occasion as an exotic curiosity, this Turkish prince at the papal court, the son of the man who'd conquered Constantinople, now living as an ornament in Rome. He hunted, he was shown off to visiting dignitaries, but he was never for one moment free, and he knew it, and he knew equally that he could never go home, because home meant the silk bowstring. He was a man suspended, kept alive because his life was valuable to other people and for no other reason, watching the years go by in a foreign city among a foreign faith, useful and doomed at the same time. He would outlive Innocent, passing along with all his value into the hands of the Borgia Pope who came next, and he'd finally die at Capua in 1495, still a prisoner, still a piece of property, a prince who spent the entire second half of his life being paid for by the brother who'd driven him into exile in the first place, and who never once set eyes on his homeland again. Innocent's dealings closer to home, in Italy itself, were rougher and considerably less profitable than the Cem arrangement. He picked a fight with the King of Naples, Ferrante, also called Ferdinand I, and it went about as badly as Innocent's fights generally tended to go, which is to say badly for Innocent and worse for the people he dragged into it. Naples owed feudal tribute to the Papacy, an old arrangement going back centuries, a formal acknowledgement that the King of Naples held his crown in some sense from the Pope, and Ferrante was a hard, cold, calculating king who didn't much care to keep paying it. He'd also backed Borgia against Innocent in the conclave, so there was already bad blood between them from the very start. When Ferrante's heavy-handed centralizing rule provoked a serious revolt among his own great nobles, the famous Barons' Conspiracy of the mid-1480s, Innocent saw his chance and threw the weight of the papacy behind the rebel barons. That was a serious miscalculation, and it went sour fast. Naples pushed back hard, harder than Innocent had reckoned on. The Duke of Calabria, Ferrante's son and heir, marched a Neapolitan army straight up into the Papal States and brought it all the way to the very gates of Rome, and Innocent suddenly found himself with no allies willing to actually come and save him, an army of his own that hadn't been paid and was on the verge of open mutiny, and a college of cardinals rapidly losing patience with the whole expensive misadventure. The papacy simply did not have the money or the military strength to fight a real war, which was the recurring problem of Innocent's whole reign, that his ambitions and his resources never once matched. And here it caught up with him at the worst possible moment, with an enemy army camped near his own city. So he folded. In August of 1486, he signed a humiliating separate peace, essentially abandoning the very barons he had encouraged and inflamed and promised to support, leaving them exposed and alone. And there's a small, telling detail buried in the middle of that failure. When the peace was made, the Pope reportedly had to reach for money in a way that captures the whole hollow grandeur of his position. The papal court in these years was so strapped that valuables ended up pledged and pawned to raise cash. The mitre and the treasures of the office turned into collateral, the trappings of the richest institution in Christendom hocked to cover the bills of a pope who couldn't pay his own soldiers. Sit with that image, the crown of the papacy, in a pawnbroker's ledger. The most magnificent office in Europe, and its holder scrambling for coin like a gambler down on his luck, which, given the family, was maybe not the most surprising thing in the world. And then those barons found out, in the most brutal way possible, exactly what happens to men who revolt against a king like Ferrante and lose. Ferrante lured the ringleaders of the conspiracy to a wedding feast at the Castel Nuovo, the great fortress in Naples. A celebration, food and music, and the safety that was supposed to be guaranteed absolutely by the ancient laws of a king's hospitality, the sacred understanding that a guest at your table is under your protection. And in the middle of the festivities, Ferrante had them all arrested at the table. The Count of Sarno, Francesco Coppola, the royal secretary, Antonello Petrucci, others of the leading barons, seized amid the feasting and the celebration, and later beheaded, and other barons besides them were imprisoned and killed in the aftermath. Ferrante was famous, or infamous, for other grim habits too, keeping the embalmed, mummified bodies of his defeated enemies dressed in their clothing in a private museum of the dead. But the wedding feast betrayal was the one that people talked about for generations. And Innocent had helped light the fire under those men, encouraged them to rise, and then walked calmly away when the flames turned back toward him, leaving Naples to do the rest. He'd try the whole thing again a few years later, excommunicating Ferrante and then inviting the King of France, Charles VIII, to come down and take Naples for himself. A fateful invitation that helped set up the French invasion of Italy that would tear the entire peninsula apart in the wars beginning in 1494, after Innocent was safely dead and past caring. He had a real talent throughout his life for starting things he couldn't finish and then leaving other people to bleed for them. Not everything he touched was politics and money and hostages, though the line between those things and actual religion was thin to the point of vanishing in his Rome. He did the ordinary and extraordinary business of a pope as well. He confirmed Tomás de Torquemada as the Grand Inquisitor of Spain in 1487, which put the full papal stamp of approval on the Spanish Inquisition's long, grinding, terrible work of hunting converted Jews and Muslims suspected of secret heresy. Torquemada's tribunals worked by suspicion and denunciation, and the men and women dragged before them faced torture designed to extract confessions and the names of others. And at the end of it, those found guilty and unrepentant were handed over to the secular authorities to be burned alive in public ceremonies, the great autos da fe that drew crowds. Innocent didn't invent the Spanish Inquisition, and he didn't run it. but his confirmation gave it the papal legitimacy it needed to keep operating, and so his signature sits somewhere in the paperwork behind those fires too. The same pattern as the witch bull, a distant pope signing off on machinery that would grind human beings to ash for generations after him. He went after the Waldensians, an old dissenting Christian group who had survived for centuries in the remote high valleys of the Alps, issuing a bull against them and prompting a crusade up into the mountains of Dauphiné and Piedmont to root them out, sending armed men climbing up into isolated valleys to hunt down people whose only real crime was worshipping God in a way Rome hadn't authorized. And what happened up in those valleys was genuinely savage. The Waldensians were poor mountain folk, farmers and herders living in some of the most inaccessible country in Europe, precisely because being hard to reach had kept them alive through generations of persecution. The crusade, Innocent authorized, sent soldiers and inquisitors up after them anyway, and the accounts that survive describe families driven from their villages into the high passes in winter, hunted through the snow, some of them taking refuge in caves in the mountainsides where the soldiers lit fires at the entrances and suffocated them inside. Women and children and old people together, dead in the dark of a mountain cave, because a pope in Rome had signed a document declaring their faith a heresy to be purged. It's one of the uglier things done under his name, and it gets far less attention than the blood story precisely because it was done to obscure people in a remote place and nobody dressed it up into a legend. There was no Gothic embellishment needed. It was just killing, sanctioned from Rome, carried out in the snow. And he tangled with one of the most brilliant minds of the entire age, Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, the young philosophical prodigy who had drawn up an astonishing 900 theses on philosophy, religion, magic, and the unity of all human wisdom, and who proposed to travel to Rome and defend all 900 of them in public debate against anyone who cared to challenge him. Pico was young, dazzlingly gifted, absurdly confident, one of those figures the Renaissance threw up, who seemed to have read everything and feared nothing. Innocent had a commission examine the theses, and 13 of them were condemned as heretical or dangerous, and eventually the whole collection was banned outright. Pico's book became one of the very first printed works that the Church suppressed, which earns it a small, grim footnote in the long history of banned books, and it took the personal intervention of Lorenzo the Magnificent, Innocent's own in-law, to smooth the whole thing over and keep the brilliant young Pico out of real and lasting danger. It's a small illustration of how the family alliance actually worked in practice, that the Pope's daughter-in-law's father could reach in and shield a philosopher from the Pope's own censure, the private ties of the Cybo and Medici families quietly overriding the public machinery of the Church. He also lived just long enough to see the fall of Granada in January of 1492. The final surrender of the last Muslim kingdom in Spain, the end of the centuries-long Christian reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula. He celebrated it in Rome with real joy, and he granted Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain the honorific title of their Catholic majesties, a title the Spanish crown would carry proudly for centuries afterward. There were bullfights and festivities in Rome to mark the news. The old, ailing Pope presiding over the celebration of a triumph 1,000 miles away, one of the last public high points of a reign that was mostly running downhill by then. That very same year, 1492, the world was about to change in ways that not a single soul in Rome could have imagined, as ships prepared to sail west into the Atlantic, though Innocent would be dead in his tomb before any word of what they found could possibly reach him. His tomb inscription, added later by hopeful hands, would actually try to claim a share of the reflected glory from the discovery of the New World, which is more than a bit of a reach for a man who died before Columbus even made it back across the ocean. But tombs are written by the living, and the living always have their own reasons for what they carve in bronze. By the early 1490s, though, the whole story turns inward, away from politics and hostages and bulls, and toward the body, because Innocent's body was failing him in slow and genuinely terrible ways, and the last chapter of his life is hard to read even at a distance of 500 years. It's worth taking a moment first with how his own contemporaries actually saw him, because the picture is more mixed than the catalogue of scandals might suggest. Personally, people found him likable, genuinely. He was affable, mild, kindly in his manner, easy to be around, and more than one account says that people who dealt with him came away fond of him. He wasn't cruel by nature the way some rulers of the age were cruel. He didn't have the cold viciousness of a Ferrante or the ruthless appetite of a Borgia. What he lacked was strength, backbone, the capacity to govern hard and well in a hard age that demanded it, and so the judgment on him tended to be that he was weak and mediocre rather than wicked, a decent enough man in the small human sense who happened to be catastrophically unsuited to the office he'd bought his way into. The fiery Dominican preacher Savonarola, who was thundering against corruption from Florence in these years, and would soon shake all of Italy with his sermons before meeting his own terrible end at the stake, publicly chastised Innocent for his worldly ambition and his neglect of the Church's real duties. And the great historians who came later, weighing the whole reign, tend to call it brazenly corrupt and, in the round, disastrous, a papacy that took everything wrong with the office and did nothing to fix any of it. He sits, in the memory of the Church, wedged between two more famous popes, the nepotistic Sixtus, who came before, and the notorious Borgia, who came after, often overshadowed by both, a sort of grey, weak, agreeable man, presiding quietly over the same rot they practiced more spectacularly. But that grey mildness is part of what makes him worth looking at, because the damage a weak and pleasant man can preside over almost passively, almost by simply not resisting, turns out to be just as real as the damage done by the monsters, and in the case of that witch bull, longer lasting than most. He had grown enormously fat over his years on the throne, feasting as popes feasted, and gout had settled deep into his joints, that agonizing disease of rich men and rich diets that swells and inflames the joints until the lightest touch is unbearable. And then the obesity and the gout gave way to something worse, a general collapse, a wasting and long stretches where he sank into a heavy, unnatural, lethargic sleep so deep that the people around his bed weren't always certain he was still breathing at all. Coma is the word we'd reach for now. He would slip down under the surface of consciousness, and the whole court would hold its breath and wait, and then, after a time, he would somehow surface again, a little weaker each time, a little further gone, the intervals of clarity growing shorter. A Florentine writer named Filippo Valori described what the Pope had been reduced to near the very end, and the description is stark and stays with you. An inert mass of flesh, he called him, a body incapable of taking in any nourishment at all except a few drops of milk from a young woman's breast. That was the state of him, a dying old man, too far gone even to swallow ordinary food, kept barely alive on drops of milk from a wet nurse because his ruined and failing body could accept nothing else and would reject everything else. There's an old medical logic underneath it. A milk diet was a genuine period prescription for wasting and dying patients, thought to be the gentlest possible nourishment for a body that could handle nothing more. But the raw image of it, the most powerful churchman in all of Christendom, the successor of St. Peter, the man who had crowned kings and jailed princes, reduced at the end to taking a mouthful of a young woman's breast milk at a time because that was all that remained to him, is precisely what the chroniclers of the age could not resist writing down. And it is true, or at least true enough that the people gathered at his bedside believed it and recorded it. The medicine of the day had nothing to offer a man in that condition, and it's worth remembering just how little any physician could actually do in 1492, because it matters for what comes next. The learned doctors of the 15th century worked from a system inherited from the ancient world, the theory of the four humours, blood and phlegm, and the two biles, and the idea that health was a balance among them, and illness a matter of one running to excess. Their tools were bloodletting, purging, special diets, and a vast pharmacy of herbs and minerals and stranger things, some of it useful by accident, much of it useless, some of it actively poisonous. When a patient of great importance was dying, and the ordinary measures had all failed, the pressure on his physicians was enormous, and the temptation to try something drastic, something desperate, something outside the usual bounds, grew with every hour that the great man sank lower. A pope was not an ordinary patient. The doctors who failed to save a pope had reason to fear for a great deal more than their reputations. And into exactly that situation of desperation and fear and helplessness, with an emperor of the church dissolving into an inert mass of flesh on the bed, and his physicians watching their own futures dissolve along with him, comes the story that made this pope's name, the one thing about him that outlived the tomb and the bronze and everything else. Which brings us finally back to the boys, and to the story that put this pope's name in your search history in the first place. And I want to walk through this slowly and carefully, not to drain it of its horror, because it has plenty, but because the way this particular story has grown and mutated and swollen over 5 centuries is itself a real part of the horror. And the actual thing that may have happened in that room is grim enough on its own without any of the embellishments that later generations kept piling on top of it. The whole tale rests at its very root on the word of one man, Stefano Infessura. He was the secretary of the Roman Senate, an educated and observant Roman with a front-row seat to the life of the city, and he kept a diary of Rome across exactly these years, the Diario della Città di Roma, and it's a vivid, gossipy, blood-soaked chronicle, absolutely packed with murders and scandals and portents and the daily texture of a violent city. It's also, crucially, written by a man with a serious axe to grind against the papacy. Infessura was tied closely to the Colonna family, the great aristocratic rivals of papal power in Rome, and he ran with an anti-papal humanist crowd, the sort of educated men who resented the corruption and the worldliness of the Renaissance popes, and were not shy about it. He disliked the papacy, as an institution and often as individuals, and he wrote down more or less every ugly rumor about it that ever drifted past his ear, whether or not it was true, whether or not he could check it. The Catholic Encyclopedia, trying hard to be fair to him, says that he put down in his chronicle every fragment of the most preposterous and malevolent gossip current in Roman society, and that he is therefore not a reliable chronicler and can only be used with the greatest caution and after very careful criticism. So the single original source for the blood story, the one man everything ultimately traces back to, is not a neutral or detached witness. He's a committed partisan, aligned with the Pope's enemies, industriously collecting the very worst things that anyone in a hostile city was saying about a pope he despised. None of that automatically makes the story false, and I want to be honest about that too. Hostile witnesses sometimes record true things, and Rome in these years really was full of genuine horrors, so the mere fact that Infessura hated the papacy doesn't prove the boys didn't die. What it does mean is that we're standing on a single, cracked, tilted foundation, and everything built on top of it inherits that instability. When only one source reports something, and that source is a man with every reason to want it to be true and no habit of checking whether it was, you're right to hold the whole thing loosely. And the case for holding it loosely gets stronger the moment you notice that the story's later fame rests not on Infessura's actual words, but on what generations of retellers did to them, each one polishing and sharpening and dramatizing, until the murky note in a partisan's diary became a confident chapter in the history of medicine. Here is roughly what Infessura actually wrote, and I want you to notice that it is narrower and stranger and less cinematic than the legend it eventually became. As the Pope lay dying, a physician, described as a Jewish doctor, took blood from 3 boys, each of them around 10 years old, who had been promised a ducat apiece, presumably paid to their poor parents. And the 3 boys died. That's the core of it. 3 boys, bled and dead, in the course of some attempt to treat or cure the dying Pope. Whether Infessura's own words even clearly state that the blood ever actually reached the Pope's body, that he drank it or was given it in any form, is genuinely murky and disputed among the people who've gone back to the original text. The earliest version of the story is really more about 3 dead children and a doctor who then fled, than about any specific medical procedure that we would recognize or could reconstruct. And this is the point where the story gets more complicated than it first appears, because there's an old and loaded accusation sitting right inside that account, and it shapes how you have to read it. The image of a Jewish physician draining the blood of Christian children wasn't a fresh or neutral detail in the 1490s. It matched something Europe already had a name for: the blood libel, the recurring accusation that Jews murdered Christian children and used their blood, a charge that had been leveled again and again across medieval Europe and had led to Jewish communities being accused, tortured, expelled, and killed over and over for generations before Infasura ever picked up his pen. It was one of the most familiar and combustible accusations of the age. So when a hostile chronicler, in the middle of smearing a dead pope he despised, reaches for the ready-made story of a Jewish doctor and 3 drained Christian boys, the story lands in a groove that had already been carved very deep. And there's a fact worth setting right beside it. Innocent himself had licensed and shown favor to a Jewish physician during his reign, a real, named man, Abram de Balmes, granting him permission to practice. So the documented relationship between this pope and Jewish doctors ran the opposite way from the story. He protected one. The tale has another killing children for him. Those 2 things sit uneasily next to each other, and I'll leave them there for you to weigh. Now, the part that everyone actually quotes, the version that made this pope famous, the transfusion, the pope drinking the blood of 3 children in a desperate attempt to become young and strong again. That specific and lurid version is not really an Infasura at all. The transfusion framing came together mainly in the 19th century, when historians like Sismondi and then Pasquale Villari retold the old episode and dressed it up in the shiny new language of a medical experiment, of science. Villari described a Jewish physician proposing a blood transfusion by means of some new instrument. The difficult experiment attempted 3 times, 3 boys losing their lives, the Pope receiving no benefit whatsoever. And once the story was framed that way, as a transfusion, a procedure, it took on a whole vigorous second life, because people started calling it the first blood transfusion in history. This grisly, precocious, doomed Renaissance medical first, performed on a dying pope. It became a fixture in popular histories of medicine, and you'll still find it repeated confidently today. The pope who received the first transfusion, 3 boys dead for it, told as settled fact in books that should know better. The trouble with that framing, and a Dutch medical historian named Lindeboom laid this out back in the 1950s, is the plain question of how a blood transfusion in the year 1492 would even have worked. Nobody in the world understood how blood circulated through the body at that point. The circulation of the blood, the fact that the heart pumps it around a closed loop, wasn't worked out and demonstrated until William Harvey, well over a century later, in the 1600s. In 1492 there was no concept of it, and so no obvious way to imagine getting blood out of one person's vein and into another person's vein and having it accomplish anything. The instruments for it didn't exist. The knowledge didn't exist. So whatever happened in that room, if anything happened at all beyond a rumor, a transfusion in the modern sense is hard to picture. At the most, the boy's blood might have been drawn to be used in something, some potion, some concoction the doctor meant for the Pope to drink, since drinking was really the only route available for getting anything into a dying man's body. Another of the old accounts, from a chronicler named Reinaldus writing later, frames it that way, as a fraudulent healer who promised a cure and drew the boy's blood to compound some remedy by a chemical process, with the Pope himself horrified when he learned what had been done in his name, and the physician fleeing the city before he could be seized. So what do we actually have when you peel back all the accumulated layers of retelling? We have one hostile chronicler recording that 3 boys were bled and died during the Pope's final illness. We have a physician who may have been running some desperate, useless, fatal treatment on a dying man, and who may equally simply have been a con man exploiting a rich and desperate patient, and who then fled. We have an accusation whose shape matches one of the oldest and most familiar charges leveled against Jews in medieval Europe, and we have 3 full centuries of enthusiastic retelling that took a murky, single-sourced rumor and built it up, first into a tale of a pope drinking children's blood to cheat death, and then into a proud landmark in the history of medical science, far more than the original source actually says. The historians who have gone back and examined the evidence, Lindeboom and Gottlieb, who titled his study A Fable Agreed Upon, and above all the great and thorough papal historian Ludwig von Pastor, mostly come down on the skeptical side. Pastor called the story wholly incredible, and he made a sharp point along the way that the diplomatic dispatches sent home from Rome at exactly that time, the letters written by the ambassadors stationed in the city, whose entire job was to report every rumor and scandal back to their masters, say nothing about any such thing. If 3 boys had really been drained to death in the Vatican in a bid to save the dying Pope, you might expect that to turn up somewhere in those letters, the diplomatic gossip of the century. It doesn't. Whether that silence settles the question or just deepens it is, in the end, yours to decide. The people whose job was to notice everything left no note of it. What we're left holding, then, is not a clean, solid fact, and not a clean, obvious fabrication either. It's something in between the two, and honestly, it's stranger and sadder for sitting in that in-between. 3 children may very well have died in that room, or somewhere near it, in the last dark days of a dying pope, caught up in some grim and useless medical gamble by a physician who then ran for his life when it went wrong. Whether it was a transfusion, hard as that is to picture in 1492, or a potion, or an outright fraud, or a rumor built up out of some smaller and quieter and equally sad truth about children and a doctor and a dying man, we can't say for certain, and anyone who tells you they know for sure is telling you more than the evidence allows. But the picture that survives, an old man too ruined and wasted even to eat, and small boys quietly led in from the poor streets of Rome and bled out, and a doctor vanishing into the night, and none of them, not the Pope and not the children living through it, has more than enough real darkness folded into it that it never needed a single one of the embellishments that people kept adding. The legend took a genuinely bleak deathbed and made it lurid and cinematic, but the bleakness underneath was always already there, waiting, and you don't have to invent anything to feel it. 3 families in Rome, poor enough that a single ducat was worth handing over a child for. A father or a mother somewhere in that violent, hungry city, agreeing to let a physician take their son to the Vatican because the money mattered more than the risk they may not have fully understood. And then the boys not coming home. Whether the Pope ever drank a drop of anything or whether it was all a con, Those three small absences are real in every version of the story, and they belong to people whose names nobody thought worth writing down, unlike the Pope's, which is carved in bronze. The chronicler recorded the 10-year-olds as a detail in the death of a great man, but the death of the great man was ordinary, the natural end of a fat and gouty old body. It's the children who are the strange and terrible part, and they arrive in the record almost as an afterthought, a line in a hostile diary, gone before anyone even asks who they were. Innocent died on the 25th of July, 1492. His last days were tense and undignified and heavy with the sense of vultures already circling. The Prince Cem, the valuable Ottoman hostage, had to be placed under special reinforced guard because there were real and reasonable fears that Franceschetto, the Pope's son, might try to seize the hostage in the coming chaos and cart him off as a prize, the same Franceschetto who had once already tried to grab the treasury on a false rumor of his father's death. And at the very bedside of the dying Pope, in the room where he lay, the two great cardinals, Giuliano della Rovere and Rodrigo Borgia, the two men who had bought Innocent his throne 8 years earlier, nearly came to open blows with each other. Two men who genuinely despised one another, already snarling and jockeying for the succession, while the man they'd made was still lying there, not yet even cold. Innocent, in his final lucid hours, is said to have begged the cardinals gathered around his bed to choose a better man than himself to succeed him, to do better for the Church than he had done. A strange, sad, self-aware little plea from a man who evidently understood, right at the end, more or less exactly what he had been and what his reign had amounted to. And it was, of course, completely and immediately ignored, because the man the cardinals chose next, 2 weeks later, was Rodrigo Borgia, who took the name Alexander VI, and whose reign of poison and bribery and open scandal would make Innocent's corruption look almost quaint and modest by comparison. His dying wish for a better successor produced possibly the most notorious pope in the entire history of the Church. He'd left his relatives a fortune, something on the order of 48,000 ducats, the accumulated proceeds of all those sold offices and skimmed court fines and Ottoman retainer payments, funneled carefully to the family right up to the very end, because providing for his children had been, in a sense, the organizing principle of his whole papacy. Everything he'd done, the offices invented and sold, the marriages arranged, the money taken from the sultan, all of it had bent toward the same modest goal, which was to make sure his kids landed softly. And they did. Franceschetto walked away rich, married into the Medici, tied by blood now to a family that would produce popes. Whatever else you say about Innocent, and there's plenty, he succeeded at the one thing he seems to have cared about most, which was his own children. And he succeeded at it by treating the papacy as a private asset to be stripped for their benefit. A tender father and a disastrous pope. And the two facts were really the same fact wearing different clothes, and then his death did to Rome exactly what every papal death did to Rome, only this time worse. The city came apart at the seams once again, the same way it had when Sixtus died and Innocent himself was elected in the chaos. In the days between his death and the eventual election of his successor, with no supreme authority holding the streets and every family free to settle old accounts, the great houses of Rome went at each other and at their enemies with knives in the dark. The count that comes down to us, through Infessura once again, and later repeated by Alexandre Dumas, quoting Infessura's journal, is that 220 murders were committed in the streets of Rome in that single lawless stretch between the Pope's death and the new election. 220. Women were carried off in the night. The bodies of the murdered were found lying in the streets in the mornings, discovered by whoever opened their shutters first. The ordinary daily business of a great city that suddenly had no one left to keep any kind of order at all. And it went on and on like that until the white smoke finally rose and settled the question of who would hold the keys of St. Peter next, and some semblance of authority returned to the streets. And the man that white smoke announced, the successor to a pope who had spent his dying breath begging for a better one, was Rodrigo Borgia. Alexander VI, elected on the 11th of August 1492 by a conclave that Borgia bought about as openly as any election in the history of the office had ever been bought. Wagon loads of silver reportedly moving to the houses of cardinals who switched their votes. The Renaissance papacy, at its most nakedly corrupt, had produced Innocent, and then Innocent's death produced Borgia, each one a step down a staircase that seemed to have no bottom. Whatever sins bronze could cover on Innocent's tomb, his successor was about to make look almost restrained by comparison. Innocent's last wish, sincere as it may have been, was answered with the single most scandalous pontificate in the memory of the Church. They buried him in the old St. Peter's, the original basilica that would later be torn down and replaced by the one that stands today, and the great sculptor Antonio del Pollaiuolo cast him a magnificent bronze tomb, which actually still survives, moved and reset and relocated several times over the intervening centuries as the basilica was rebuilt around it. One writer observed, with a certain dryness, that the bronze covered his sins, which is really about the kindest and most useful thing that bronze can do for any man. His effigy on the tomb holds a model of the Holy Lance, the very relic that the Ottoman Sultan had sent him as part of the deal to jail his brother, cast there in metal above his grave for all time, so that the single strangest transaction of his entire strange life ended up memorialized in the bronze that lies over his bones. And the inscription, added later by admiring or simply optimistic hands, tried to tie his name to the glory of the discovery of a new world, an event he did not live to see, accomplished by a man he never met, funded by monarchs he had blessed for reasons that had nothing whatsoever to do with any ocean or any western voyage. The living gave him a discovery he had no part in, because the living wanted their dead pope to have been part of something great, and bronze doesn't argue. The tomb is worth seeing, if you're ever in the new St. Peter's, because it's a genuinely fine piece of work, one of the first great papal tombs to show a pope both dead and alive at once, the recumbent effigy of the corpse below, and a seated blessing figure of the living pope above, hand raised in benediction over everyone who passes. Pollaiuolo gave him dignity in bronze that he never quite earned in life. a serene and paternal figure presiding calmly over the visitors, the very picture of holy authority. And you can stand in front of it now, 500 years on, and look at that raised hand of blessing, and know that the man it represents took money from a sultan, sold the offices of the church by the dozen, put his seal on the book that helped burn tens of thousands of women, and died on a bed being fed drops of milk while children were bled somewhere close by. The bronze says one thing, the record says another, and the bronze, being bronze, will outlast every one of us, still blessing the crowds long after the last person who read the fine print has gone. And that, more or less, is Innocent VIII. The father who called his children his own out loud, when every other pope hid theirs behind the word nephew. The man who sold the offices of the church by the dozen, inventing new ones just to sell them, and then let a pair of forgers hang and burn for doing badly, and on a small scale exactly what he did brazenly and on a grand one. The pope who took a Turkish sultan's gold year after year to keep a Muslim prince in a gilded cage, and took the sultan's holy relic to seal the bargain, and put that relic on his own tomb. The seal at the front of a book that helped feed the fires that burned tens of thousands of women across 2 centuries of Europe. And at the last, the old man on the enormous bed, too far gone to swallow anything but a mouthful of milk at a time, while somewhere close by in the same building 3 boys from the poor streets were quietly bled and did not get up again. And a frightened doctor ran into the Roman night, and a chronicler with a lifelong grudge against the papacy wrote all of it down, and then let 500 years of retelling do the rest of the work. All right. Before I let you slip back into whatever the rest of your day looks like, thank you for spending this long stretch of it here with me and a dead Renaissance Pope neither of us would ever have wanted at our dinner table. These long ones take a while to make and a while to sit through, and the fact that you stayed all the way to the end genuinely means a lot. If something in here got under your skin, or if you know a corner of this story I skipped, come find me in the comments. The next one's already half built and waiting, so I'll see you back here soon. Until then, look after yourself, and try to be a little gentler with the people around you than anyone in this story managed.